There we go. Thank you, Alan. So hi again, everyone. Welcome to this online forum, which we are calling an introduction to the diocesan balance sheet. My name is Andrew Walter, and I serve the diocese as canon to the ordinary and chief operating officer. I'm joined tonight by Alan Fitzpatrick, the executive assistant to the canons, who is serving as our technical host, and also Chris Roush, who you can see on the screen. Chris works for our accounting firm, Vault Consulting. So although Chris is not an employee of the diocese, he is sort of an adjunct member of our staff and is certainly part of our diocesan family. And Chris is here to help me answer any questions that people might have. And that's really part of our goal for tonight. It's first to provide a basic introduction to the assets and funds of the diocese, and then to answer any questions you may have. All of the information that I will share is available in the annual audit of the diocesan finances, and I encourage you to look through the audit. The audit can be found in the Diocesan Journal, which is published every year and available on our diocesan website. And I am actually going to post a link to the journal in the chat. There you go. So that link will take you to the journal, which contains the annual audit. So as I'm talking, I do invite questions. We are going to share the screen, so maybe type into the chat or click the raised hand button at the bottom of the screen if you have a question, and I will take those as they come in. And I'll also pause every once in a while to open the floor for questions. Okay, let's get started. Alan is going to share the screen. Great, thank you, Alan. And on this first screen, you see an overall summary of the diocesan assets. The assets include cash and cash equivalents, property, investments, and interests in perpetual trusts. We'll be talking through each and every one of these, and I'll start with the cash and cash equivalents, which are exactly what they sound like. It is money in our bank account. We regularly monitor the amount of cash we have on hand to ensure that we have enough funds to meet the obligations of the diocese, while not having too much money lying around, not earning any kind of interest. Last summer, when Treasury bill rates increased above 4%, we did take $2 million from our bank account and invest that money into short-term T-bills. Those short-term treasuries are an example of what is meant by cash equivalents. They are very liquid, short-term investments. Right now at $5.7 million, our level of cash and cash equivalents is a little higher than we usually average over time. And we are looking to increase the amount of money we have invested in treasury bills so that we can earn a little bit more interest on those funds. I think that's it on the cash, cash equivalents, treasury bills. Any questions on that? Okay, I'm going to move on and start talking about the property. But again, anytime you have questions, please just type into the chat or click the raised hand button. The diocese owns two pieces of property, one in Germantown and the other in Landover. Both are empty lots and around 4.5 acres. I believe the diocese bought the property in Germantown back in the mid-1980s, presumably with the idea of building a church there. And I think the Bright Seat Road property was bequeathed to the diocese. But please don't hold me to that. In preparing for tonight, I didn't go back and look at the history of the assets. I think that is something we will want to do as a diocese over the next 2 years, especially as the Reparations Committee goes about its work. But that takes some research, and we just were not able to do that in preparation for tonight. Also, just a note that the diocese does not own Church House, where the diocesan offices are located. Church House is owned by the cathedral, and we are able to use it rent-free. One of the many ways that the cathedral supports our common life and mission. I'm not seeing any questions. So I'll continue. And next we will talk about the diocesan funds. It's important to note that there are different types of funds. There are donor-restricted funds, which can only be used for a particular purpose as determined by the donor. These donor-restricted funds are permanently restricted, meaning their purpose can't be changed. And donor-restricted funds might come with restrictions on how much of the funds can be used. For example, there might be a limitation that says you can use income from a fund, but you can never touch the principal that was originally given. Then there are non-donor restricted funds. These are funds that don't have any restrictions placed on them. These funds might be completely unrestricted so that they can be used for any purpose, or the funds may be designated by convention or council to be used in certain ways. First, we will look at some of our donor-restricted funds, beginning with funds that are subject to our endowment spending policy. Now, the funds you see listed on the screen right now are not all of our donor-restricted funds, but these are the largest. If you want to see the full list of the donor-restricted funds, please do go and review the audit. The largest of our restricted funds is the SOPR Fund. And the SOPR Fund supports the operating budget of the diocese. This year, we will withdraw 4.7% of the 3-year rolling average of the fund. Over time, we are trying to reduce the percentage draw to 4% in order to preserve the long-term real purchasing power of the SOPR Fund. The Catherine Winthrop Keene Fund was established by a bequest back in 1975 with income to provide Christian hospitality to strangers of all denominations in the nation's capital. Money from the Keene Fund is dispersed on approval by the bishop. The Angus Dunn Fellowship Fund was established in 1971 with income designated to support for clergy continuing education. Funds from the Angus Dunn Fund are dispersed on approval from the bishop's office. Then we have the St. Mary's School Fund, which provides income distributed by the St. Mary's Scholarship Committee for aid to minority students in St. Mary's County, Maryland. The Scholarship Committee consists of clergy and lay leaders from Southern Maryland. And right now, the Reverend John Ball, the retired rector of Trinity St. Mary's, is the current chair, while Mildred Reyes is the liaison from diocesan staff. Income from the George C. Remy Fund is used for the benefit of the poor, the needy, and others needing assistance, while income from the Ruth M. Hoxie Fund is used to provide housing for needy, aged persons? The Migra Fund was established in 1974 when the Girls Friendship Society ceased operations and its assets were turned over to the diocese. Income from this fund is to be used for work with and for women. Finally, the Seminary Support Fund provides educational support for seminarians and is paid directly to the seminary as a partial offset for tuition. Okay, so let me pause there. That's a lot of information that I just shared, a lot of information there on the screen, and I want to give participants a chance to ask any questions. We haven't had any questions yet, so let me pause and open up the floor. Yes, Phil. Phil, you need to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
When a donor has restricted funds to give to the diocese, who authorizes to accept the fund? Is it the standing committee or the diocesan council?
Wow, that's a really good question. I would presume it's the diocesan council because council has responsibility for the finances of the diocese. Chris, do you know, does that sound right to you, Chris?
Yeah, that's correct. It's typically, it hasn't been very often that we've turned down a gift, but it has happened in the past. Typically when the restrictions on a cemetery fund or something along those lines, with just, it's a lot of maintenance that you're getting yourself into, but it hasn't, like I said, it hasn't happened very often, but yes, if it's directed to the council, we will sometimes say that's not something we would like to accept. But again, very rare.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chris.
Sure.
Other questions? If there are, again, please type into the chat or push the raised hand button because we're sharing the screen. I may not be able to see you if you raise your hand like that. Yes. Hi, Beth.
Hi, Andrew.
Good to see you.
Good to see you. I was wondering if the Seton Belt Fund falls into this category and what you can tell us about it.
Great question. Seton Belt does not, but if you just give me a little bit of time, we'll get to Seton Belt.
Perfect. Thank you.
Great. Okay. As we talk about all of the different funds tonight, one logical question is who gets to decide when funds are used? As you heard in some cases that I just mentioned, there is a committee. Other times it is the diocesan council, which, as I said, is responsible for the finances of the diocese, or it may be the bishop. It depends upon the fund. And any decision to spend these donor-restricted funds must include a consideration of whether or not the expenditure meets the spirit of the donor's intent. Now, speaking of Seton Belt, let's talk about some of our other donor-restricted funds. The first is Seton Belt, the fund that Beth asked about.
No, just Quinn was over there wanting to get in.
You may remember when I first started and we looked at a summary of our assets, I spoke about the diocese having interests in perpetual trusts. One of those perpetual trusts is the Seton Belt Trust. And every year we receive income from that trust, as do the other trust beneficiaries. The income we receive goes into the Seton Belt Fund, and that money is designated to support retired clergy. Specifically, every year we use the Seton Belt Fund to provide retired clergy from the diocese and their spouses with a subsidy to offset the annual cost of health care. This year, we sent a check of $2,400 to each person. The second fund is the Corton Fund for Education. And this fund comes from a fairly recent bequest, and it is used to support education as determined by the bishop. In recent years, we have used money from the Corton Fund to support the School for Christian Faith and Leadership. So those are the other two donor-restricted funds that I wanted to mention. Beth, does that help answer your question around Seton Belt?
Yes, but I was perhaps not quite understanding the original donor's intent and designation of how those funds would be used.
Right. So as I understand it, and Chris, correct me if I'm wrong, is that I'm presuming it was Seton Belt who set up the Seton Belt Trust. And there are several beneficiaries of that trust, of which we are one. And every year we receive money from the trust, and those funds are designated to support retired clergy. That's what the money is designated for. Chris, is that right? Did I say that all correctly?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, the intent of the trust is to take care of the aging and retired clergy in the diocese.
Thank you.
Other questions about any of these donor restricted funds or what the meaning of a donor restricted fund? Okay, let's move on then and talk about our non-donor restricted funds. As I said earlier, these funds are not permanently restricted, though they are often designated for particular purposes. The first and largest of our non-donor restricted funds is what we call the Closed Parish Fund. As the name suggests, the money in this fund came from the sale of closed parish property. For those who may not know, if and when a parish closes, its remaining assets and property revert to the diocese. So at some point in the past, parishes were closed and the diocese sold the properties, with the proceeds from the sale going into this fund. Now, I realize some people may wonder which parishes were closed, when was the property sold, for how much? Well, I don't have that information as of right now, but I have asked Chris, who's on the call, to look into that history and see what records we have. Hopefully, we should have some answers in another month or so. And when we do, we will certainly share that with people around the diocese. And if need be, we will also ask the diocesan archivist to do some further research. One last point about that closed parish fund. Back in 2006, Diocesan Council formulated a policy for dealing with the proceeds from the real estate sales of closed parishes. And the money in the closed parish fund is designated for the purchase of new land and new church plants. Next up is the Wilmer Conference Fund. This fund is used to support parish retreats and conferences. In December of 2021, the Diocesan Council approved a $150,000 gift to the Claggett Center's Building the Barn Capital campaign, with the money coming from the Wilmer Fund. The Edward Corton and Edward Williams funds were established for future projects, and the money is reserved for special use at the discretion of Diocesan Council. Finally, Episcopal Funds 2 and 3 are a combination of many smaller funds, all of which are grouped together in what we call the Diocesan Investment Fund. The Diocesan Investment Fund is our portfolio of investments. It includes the funds we are talking about tonight, but also money from parishes who want to invest in the portfolio. The Diocesan Investment Fund is overseen by the Investment Committee, who works with our investment advisor, Vanguard, subject to our investment policy statement. More information about the Diocesan Investment Fund is available on the Diocesan website. And I am going to post a link in the chat right now. And on this page, hang on, there you go. On that page of the website, you can see the investment policy statement, the listing of members of the investment committee, and recent performance of the Diocesan Investment Fund. Any questions about these funds that you see on the screen or the Diocesan Investment Fund? Yes, Phil.
The Episcopal Fund, which is the investment funds,
Episcopal Funds 2 and 3. Yes, go
Yes.
ahead.
they include the diocese investment funds, right? It doesn't include like all the individual parishes.
Right. So that number you see there, the 1.4 million is money that belongs to the diocese.
Okay.
Right. None of what I'm talking about tonight are funds that belong to individual parishes.
Got it.
Yeah, we don't carry any of those on our balance sheet.
Correct.
We have it in the investment, but we do not carry them as assets of the diocese.
Right. Any other questions? Okay, again, please do go to that page on the website that has information about the Diocesan Investment Fund and our investment policy statement. And you can see, as I said, the recent performance of the investment fund. Okay, that brings us to the diocesan interests in perpetual trusts. And as you can see on the screen, there are two of them, the Seton Belt Trust and the Behringer Trust. I already spoke a little bit about the Seton Belt Trust. The income we receive from the trust supports retired clergy and their spouses. The value that you see on the screen, the value of that trust, the $30 million, is not how much money the diocese has. That $30 million generates income every year, and the diocese receives a certain portion of that income, while the trust's other beneficiaries also receive income. There's also the Behringer Trust. Income from the Behringer Trust is used at the discretion of the bishop for the benefit of clergy and their families, including any candidates for holy orders and the families of deceased clergy. Again, the figure you see on the screen is the value of the trust, not how much money this diocese has. That's really important for both of these trusts, right? We only have an interest in these trusts. Questions about that? Because the trusts they're different. Yes, Phil.
So that those two numbers you're seeing here now don't show up on our balance sheet, the diocese's balance sheet.
So I'm going to let Chris answer this. I believe they do show up on the balance sheet, which is why
Yes.
we're showing them, but they're not really our assets. Is that correct, Chris?
They do show up on the diocesan balance sheet because we are a named beneficiary. So that's the interest percentage of the total trust that we earn interest on. So it's our percentage of the total trust. We can't touch that. We can't physically pull money from that ourselves. That's at the discretion of the trustee. But since we are named as the beneficiaries, GAAP, generally accepted accounting principles, requires us to disclose the amount of the value of that trust as an asset, even though we can't just go spend it. We can only take the interest and use that interest, as Andrew alluded to earlier, with the purpose of that trust. So we can't just then say designate it however we want. It's still at the discretion of the trustee how we spend that money, of the original donor, manager of the trustee, I should say.
So Chris, just so I'm sure about this and want to make sure I understand what you said. So the Seton Belt Trust itself is actually much bigger than $30 million because
It is. It's actually, it's about double that, actually, to be honest. Yeah,
Okay. So the 30 million represents sort of our allocation based off of the amount of the
Correct.
trust income that we get. Okay.
correct.
That makes
Absolutely.
sense.
Yep.
Does that make sense to everyone? Because that's, I didn't realize that. And that's good to know.
I question whether it should be on the balance sheet, but that's fine.
Yeah, I think that is probably required otherwise, right? Which is why it's there.
It is required. It's a disclosure that has to be made. on the
I
balance
thought
sheet.
you would just put a footnote in the balance sheet, but I didn't know you would show it. It's because it's misleading. Well, it's not misleading. It's
Right,
somebody didn't know what it was. They said, wow, you guys got $30 million here.
right,
And you don't. You have authorization.
correct.
Whatever.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. A few
We're in
years
touch.
back, yep, sorry, go ahead, Andrew.
No. Go, please answer because that's important.
A few years back, FASB decided that it would make more sense to present the restricted funds as with donor restricted and without, as opposed to temp and perm restricted, temporarily restricted and permanently restricted, which kind of made a lot more sense with a permanent restricted, which this is the fund that is permanently restricted. We can't physically touch the corpus of the fund. We can only take the interest payments. The difference with the trust is we cannot we can't say how much of that we should get. Whereas with the SOPR funds at $30 million, we can say as the diocese, as the owner of those, we can say, well, we can take 4% of that. We can dictate how much of that we want to spend, as
Right.
opposed to the trust, which is the trustee determines how much we
Trustee
can get.
determines. Right. Okay.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Chris. That's really
Sure.
good information. Other questions about these trusts? Okay, in summary then, sort of back to the slide we started with, the diocesan assets include cash and cash equivalents, such as short-term treasury bills, 2 properties, investments, and interests in 2 perpetual trusts. The value of these assets as of the end of 2021, as they appear on our balance sheet, was just under $81 million. So we are very blessed as a diocese. Some of these assets, specifically the cash and the treasury bills, are very liquid assets, meaning we can get our hands on that money pretty quickly. But the other assets are less liquid because they're invested or they are actual pieces of land. So that's all that we were going to cover tonight. Are there any last questions?
Andrew, this is Bishop Marianne, and I have a question. I mean, it may be, and first of all, thank you for all of this, and thanks to all who've been on the call. But I wonder, as we move into the work around reparations, do you have an initial sense of what resources are available to us to redirect toward reparation work? Do you know? I mean, do you know what I'm saying? It's like,
Yes, of course.
it's a
Yes.
question that we're going to be wrestling with in the coming year to 2 years. And I just wonder, where do we look for that?
Right. So I would be hesitant to answer that question right now because we really, those of us on the finance team, Chris being a key member of that, we really haven't spent time thinking about that as yet.
Right.
Certainly there's, as I said, we have cash money, right? So that cash could be available.
Right.
But there are other funds that, like the SOPR fund, that's, donor restricted funds, those are permanently restricted. You can't touch that money. And so I think the answer is complicated, and one that takes some real thought
Right.
and research. And so I'd rather not
No, I completely understand. I just,
speculate too
you know,
much on that. We really need to think about that.
yeah, no, I know. The other question that has come up, and Chris, this may have to do with your research on the closed parishes and others, is, were there, I mean, I know of 2 Black congregations in Southern Maryland, as others, one other in the district. Like, what many people want to know, what happened to the assets that were part of Black churches. And I just want to put that, I mean, I know you know that, but as we move into that work, it's just the question that comes up over and over again. The other question that comes up, which again is impossible to answer, and it may not necessarily play because you said, Andrew, it's a restricted fund, but where did Mrs. Soper get her money? Where did the people who were, where did Mr. Corton get his money? The people,
Or Mr. Seton Bell.
or Mr. Seton Belt,
Right.
like
Yeah.
or
So
Mrs. Seton Belt, but
yeah, or Mrs. Seton Bell, right?
but
Yeah.
just those really hard
Question.
questions. And I'm not raising them to expect an answer tonight, but I just know that part of our struggle in these next 2 years will be to think about those things,
Right. So I would say that we actually have had some conversations about the closed parish fund, and Chris, who is thinks that he might be able to access some information about which parishes were closed, what the sale proceeds were, etc. Knows right that in particular we'd be interested to see information about Black congregations that were closed and property sold. So Chris may have some of that information, and if necessary, we could also go to the diocesan archivist. I think as far as the question, something like, I think it was Mrs. Ruth Soper who left the Soper money, but I think it was maybe Mr. Seton Belt that created that trust. As to sort of where they made that money, that's, I think, more of almost a history research project. Right. As we know, over the past year, the Reparations Committee engaged with a historian to do some research, and we may need to do that again.
Yeah. Only to raise these things by title, I just know that these are the questions that haunt us, right?
Right.
Haunt us.
And that we're going to need to answer over the next couple of years.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I guess the last thing I would say as we close is, if you have thoughts on additional topics we could cover in a follow-up session to this one, sort of going a little bit deeper into the diocesan balance sheet, please send me an email. I would love to hear additional questions or thoughts about what you would want us to explore in a follow-up session, because it's important to us to be as transparent as possible around the diocesan finances. I think that's it. So thank you all so much for joining tonight. It's really good to see you, and we will be posting a recording of this session on our YouTube channel, so it will be available to others who are not able to join us tonight. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Bye-bye.